starting the short story Dagon. I have not read. I've not read most of the primary source Lovecraft, so it should be interesting. Audio levels to where they need to be. That should be fairly good. For these little forward sections, giving details about the story, I'll do my best transatlantic accent for you all. So, there you go. Written in July 1917, Dagon is one of Lovecraft's most forward-looking stories. Many of its features: a landmass suddenly emerging from the depths of the ocean, a monster who may be one of an entire race of creatures dwelling on the underside of the world, the narrator's psychological devastation at the monster's mere existence, foreshadow the call of Cthulhu and later stories, where the supernatural has been replaced by the scientifically plausible. But as in Poe, it is the narrator's emotional trauma that is at the heart of the tale. The story was Lovecraft's first to be published in Weird Tales, October 1923. Interesting. So published 6 years after it was written. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more, penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable. I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It is one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the pack of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation. So that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal indeed was the discipline of our captors that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable island. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid, with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, nothing in sight, save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to be almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which, for innumerable millions of years, had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me, I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade in the sun as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night, I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanquished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock, which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day I still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening, I'm not sure what a hummock is either. I'm imagining some sort of hill.
Okay.
Where was I? By the fourth evening, I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon, I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy indeed. I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscence of Paradise Lost, and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. All at once my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply, about 100 yards ahead of me. An object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. The closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living, thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, almost lapping at my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the Cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting of the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean rising plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound, plainly visible across the interweaving water on account of their enormous size, were an array of bas reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of the Dore. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage to some monolithic shrine, which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint, grotesque and beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer. They were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters, vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome. It darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, above which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, and while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds, I think it went mad then. Of my frantic ascent, I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm, sometime after I reached the boat, at any rate. I know that I heard pearls of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium, I said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with my peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god, but soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing, tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information, or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often, I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever, as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man-of-war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideous, vivid vision in reply. I cannot think the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may, this very moment, be crawling, floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols, and craving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind, and of a day when the land shall sink. When the land shall sink, the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand, the window, the window. That was Dagon by HP Lovecraft.
I quite enjoyed that. I have a few questions.
Okay.
What was the specialist that he spoke to?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the hell an ethnologist is. I guess somebody who studies ethnicities. An anthropologist who studies ethnology. Academic field. This one prepares and analyzes the characteristics of different scenarios, people, and the relationships between them.
Oh. So,
Excuse me.
a anthropologist, basically. I guess an anthropological specialty, but I wouldn't know the difference between that and normal anthropology, so.
I'm gonna try to find another shorter one.
So this was all him trying to justify to his family why he's a morphine addict. Literally the whole purpose of the story. He made this shit up to get away with it.
Not necessarily
Sure.
the justification. I guess
that's
both.
It's more morbid, you know. Less funny, I guess. His writing style, like, obviously, the word I would typically use for it would be pretentious, but it doesn't really come off as pretentious. I feel like most other authors it would.
Yeah, I
It
feel
just
like
seems to kind of fit, you know.
I feel like reading it aloud just feels better than reading it, by itself. I don't know if that...
In my opinion, everything does for the most part. Like, pretty much every good author, in my opinion, sounds better out loud. Everything that's non-technical that I enjoy reading, I think, tends to work better spoken. I've said that to many people who struggle to get into Tolkien. Like, Tolkien on the page is good. Tolkien out loud is, like, almost musical very frequently. Like, just the way he writes lends itself to, like, fucking bedtime story, honestly. Like, it's got, like, a very pleasant rhythm to it that just, it goes very well out loud.
You know what? We'll go with that one next.
I request more fish people.
Well, what is it? Sorry to say, but the Shadow over Innsmouth is 52 pages, and I'm not gonna read that aloud tonight.
It's fair. I don't think I have that kind of time. By the way, the book
I
that...
I kind of want to, though. That sounds like fun. Just, like, do over... I don't know, have, like, one full stream of just reading that aloud.
Lovecraft's gotta be public domain at this point, yeah?
I believe so. That's
And
why I'm doing this.
Yeah. Oh, are you streaming at the moment?
Yes.
Oh, okay. But you could definitely, like, just upload YouTube videos if you do an audiobooks. If you do that, I would recommend you, you do them in, like, segments and, like, attempt to redo if you, like, start stumbling in a particular spot, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I would probably, I don't know.
I guess it would be easier to just cut out.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna do, is just, like, I'll probably live stream them and then, like, cut them to make, like, the nice videos for people's viewing. Or listening, rather.
By the way, while we're not in the middle of anything, I'm not sure if I told you, I did complete Eclipse 1 with everybody.
Nice.
And I'm about halfway through 2 with everybody. Now, when I say I beat Eclipse 1 with everybody, it does include Chef. That being said, I turned him into the heretic on stage 2.
Yeah.
I'm gonna attempt to beat 2 with him, actually as Chef, but I'm probably gonna abuse the Spinal Tonic. I don't know how else to do it. And when you mentioned that, ooh, Shatter Spleen, hell yeah.
Nice.
when you mentioned that you thought you couldn't get unlocks on Eclipse, it seems like you can't get the character's collection log, but you can do like their achievements and shit. Because Seeker, I have only one with on Eclipse. I don't remember if she has a skin, but I definitely didn't get a skin for her. And I didn't get her collection log. So I might actually do a command run with her next. I think she's my favorite character at the moment. I don't know if you've unlocked her alternate M2.
I believe I've unlocked pretty much everything at this point.
Yeah, I know you have the game 100%ed, but they still don't have fucking achievements for that shit for some reason. But her alternate M2 is like the orbs that circle around her.
Yeah, I like those a lot.
So, especially, dude, when you run in a circle around the enemy in the opposite direction that the orbs are spinning, you smash them into them so fucking quick. It's hilarious. So funny. And then, you have the flying ability that's like damaging you over time, but the orbs are giving you shields so quickly that it just can't. It's so fun.
Any other questions about Dagon, the story we had just read?
Out of curiosity, how many pages was it?
That was only like 3.
Oh, really? Okay. No, I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, that was one that Tom had recommended I look into. Said it was one of his favorites. I'm gonna try and do like just kind of a shotgun, like of the shorter ones tonight.
I'm not quite sure what you mean, a shotgun. But...
Just like, I don't know, a group of short stories. It seems like he has a few, like, couple-page short stories that are perfect for it.
Well, I'm down to listen to at least 1 or 2 more. So I think it may be beneficial if every like couple paragraphs you just pause, so that way if I have anything to throw in or any questions or anything, I can do so without interrupting you.
Gotcha. Alright, we have another little forward here. Let's see if we can... Alright. So, this one is Nyarlathotep. This powerful prose poem was written in early December 1920. First appeared in the United Amateur for November 1920, but at this time the United Amateur was frequently issued months later than its cover date. The quasi-Egyptian god, Nyarlathotep, makes a striking debut here. In this tale, he seems symbolic of the ultimate degeneration of the world and the universe. Like the statement of Randolph Carter, the story is largely based on a dream so striking that Lovecraft wrote the first full paragraph of the tale before he was entirely awake. Interesting.
I'm just kind of hung up on, what was it, prose poetry?
Prose poem.
So, that's what they call them. That makes no sense.
Yeah.
Pick a lane.
Yeah, I don't fucking know. Alright. Nyarlathotep. The crawling chaos. I am the last. I will tell the audient void. I do not recall distinctly when it began, but it was months ago. The general tension was horrible. To a season of political and social upheaval was added a strange and brooding apprehension of hideous physical danger. A danger widespread and all-embracing. Such a danger as may be imagined only in the most terrible phantoms of the night. I recall that the people went about with pale and worried faces and whispered warnings and prophecies which no one dared consciously repeat or acknowledge to himself that he had heard. A sense of monstrous guilt was upon the land, and out of the abysses between the stars swept chill currents that made men shiver in dark and lonely places. There was a demonic alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt that the world, and perhaps the universe, had passed from the control of known gods or forces to that of gods or forces which were unknown. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he was of the old native blood, and looked like a pharaoh. The Fellahin knelt when they saw him, yet could not say why. He said he had risen up out of the blackness of 27 centuries, and that he had heard messages from places not on this planet. Into the lands of civilization came Nyarlathotep, swarthy, slender, and sinister, always buying strange instruments of glass and metal and combining them into instruments yet stranger. He spoke much of the sciences, of electricity and psychology, and gave exhibitions of power, which sent his spectators away speechless, yet which swelled his fame to exceeding magnitude. Men advised one another to see Nyarlathotep, and shuddered. Where Nyarlathotep went, rest vanished. For the small hours were rent with the screams of nightmares. Never before had the screams of nightmares been such a public problem. Now the wise men almost wished they could forbid sleep in the small hours, that the shrieks of the cities might less horribly disturb the pale, pitying moon as it glimmered on the green waters gliding under bridges and old steeples crumbling against a sickly sky. I remember when Nyarlathotep came to my city, the great, the old, the terrible city of unnumbered crimes. My friend had told me of him, and of the impelling fascination, allurement of his revelations, and I burned with eagerness to explore his uttermost mysteries. My friends said they were horrible and oppressive beyond my most fevered screen in the darkened room prophesized things none but Nyarlathotep dared prophecy. And that in the sputter of his sparks there was taken from men that which had never been taken before, yet which showed only in the eyes. And I heard it hinted abroad that those who knew Nyarlathotep looked on sights which others saw not. It was in the hot autumn that I went through the night with the restless crowds to see Nyarlathotep. Through the stifling night, and up the endless stairs into the choking room, and shadowed on a screen, I saw hoofed forms amidst ruins, and yellow, evil faces peering from behind fallen monuments. And I saw the world battling against blackness, against the waves of destruction from ultimate space, whirling, churning, struggling around the dimming, cooling sun. And the sparks played amazingly around the heads of the spectators, and hair stood up on end, whilst shadows more grotesque than I can tell came out and squatted on the heads. And when I, who was colder and more scientific than the rest, mumbled a trembling protest about imposture and static electricity, Nyarlathotep drave us all out, down the dizzying stairs, into the damp, hot, deserted midnight streets. I screamed aloud that I was not afraid, that I never could be afraid, and others screamed with me for solace. We swear to one another that the city was exactly the same, still alive, and when the electric lights began to fade, we cursed the company over and over again, and laughed at the queer faces we made. I believe we felt something coming down from the greenish moon, for when we began to depend on its light, we drifted into curious involuntary formations, and seemed to know our destinations, though we dared not think of them. Once we looked at the pavement and found the blocks loose and displaced by grass, with scarce a line of rusted metal to show where the tramways had run. And again, we saw a tram car lone, windowless, dilapidated, and almost on its side. When we gazed around the horizon, we could not find the third tower by the river, and noticed that the silhouette of the second tower was ragged at the top. Then we split up into narrow columns, each of which seemed drawn in a different direction. One disappeared in a narrow alley to the left, leaving only the echo of a shocking moan. Another filed a weed-choked subway entrance, howling with a laughter that was mad. My own column was sucked toward the open country, and presently felt a chill, which was not of the hot autumn, for as we stalked out of the dark moor, we beheld around us the hellish moon glitter of evil snows, trackless, inexplicable snows, swept asunder in one direction only. Where lay a gulf, all blacker for its glittering walls. The column seemed very thin indeed, as it plodded dreamily into the gulf. I lingered behind, for the black rift in the green-lit snow was frightful, and I thought I had heard the reverberations of a disquieting wail as my companions vanished, but my power to linger was slight. As if beckoned by those who had gone before, I half floated between the titanic snowdrifts, quivering and afraid, into the sightless vortex of the unimaginable. Screamingly sentient, dumbly delirious, only the gods that were can tell. A sickened, sensitive shadow writhing in hands that are not hands, and whirled blindly past ghastly midnights of rotting creation. Corpses of dead worlds, with sores that were cities. Carnal winds that brush the pallid stars and make them flicker low. Beyond the world's vague ghosts, monstrous things. Half-seen columns of unsanctified temples that rest on nameless rocks beneath space and reach up to dizzy vacua above the spheres of light and darkness. And through this revolting graveyard of the universe, the muffled, maddening beating of drums and thin, monotonous whine of blasphemous flutes from inconceivable, unlighted chambers beyond time. The detestable pounding and piping whereunto dance slowly, awkwardly, and absurdly the gigantic, tenebrous ultimate gods, the blind, voiceless, mindless gargoyles whose soul is Nyarlathotep. Alright.
I feel like that had exactly zero plot. And that is not a criticism, it is an observation. Nothing happened. Which I'm okay with, you know. I was a big fan of... I'd like you to, if you may, reread the first paragraph describing him.
I gotta go back to it.
Yeah. There were two things I quite enjoyed from that. I remember one was the use of the word swarthy.
Yeah.
That's just a good word
It is a good word.
in general. I honestly think it just means dark skinned, but not like black. I would say more like Mediterranean, like Italian kind of, you know.
Alright. Now, I think you want me to reread the second paragraph.
Sure.
So, and it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he was of the old native blood and looked like a pharaoh. The Felahin knelt when they saw him, yet could not say why. He said he had risen up out of the blackness of 27 centuries, and that he had heard messages from places not on this planet. Into the lands of civilizations came Nyarlathotep, swarthy, slender, and sinister, always buying strange instruments of glass and metal and combining them into instruments yet stranger.
That's the line I wanted to hear again. It's fucking wild.
Yeah, that is a good one.
I did Google it. Swarthy does just mean dark-skinned.
Gotcha.
But I want to say it has more of a Italian type of dark skin, you know, than Africa.
Nice.
I could be making that up though.
Maybe. Excuse me.
By the way, does my mic sound good? Do I have it at a decent distance and all that?
Yeah, sounds fine.
Okay, cool. I've never used a mic that wasn't just a headset mic before, you know?
This next one is literally just one page. So.
Still bound to have more plot than the previous one.
We'll see.
I feel like the genre of short story is pretty underrated these days.
Yeah. I can agree with that.
Like, nobody's doing that. I mean, I even what George R.R. Martin wrote a series of novellas that take place before the events of Game of Thrones, and they're quite good. That's like I haven't even seen other like novellas, you know, like 100-page.
Yeah. There's supposedly one that accompanies the album Warp Riders that was written by the members of the band, The Sword. It's like actually about the plot of the album.
So I had thought that the album was based on like a book that somebody in the band had written, not the other way around, you know?
I think it's like kind of both.
I see.
I could be wrong, but it seems like they were sort of either written in tandem or like the story came first. It's something to look up, I guess. Anyway, so the next one is Azathoth. Got the little forward here. This brief fragment of a projected novel was written in June 1922. Lovecraft refers to it as a weird, Vathic-like novel, alluding to William Beckford's Vathic of 1786, an Arabian fantasy written without chapter divisions. Lovecraft had read the work the previous July. In a letter to Frank Belknap Long, that's a hell of a name. Lovecraft quotes the entire fragment, remarking the rest will be material, the Arabian Nights type. It has often been assumed that this tale, in which man travel out of life on a quest for dreams, anticipates the dream quest of unknown Kadaf. Within that novel, Randolph Carter discovers that his sought-for Sunset City is not in the dream world, but in his memories of his actual boyhood. A lot of this is predicated on knowledge of the other stories, it seems. But there are certain, hints and through lines that I'm seeing just in the couple stories that we've read so far. But here we have the very short Azathoth. When age fell upon the world, and wonder went out of the minds of men, when grey cities reared to smoky skies, tall towers grim and ugly, in whose shadow none might dream of the sun or of spring's flowering beads, when learning stripped earth of her mantle of beauty, and poets sang no more save of twisted phantoms seen with bleared and inward-looking eyes. When these things have come to pass, and childish hopes had gone away forever, there was a man who traveled out of life quest into the spaces whither the world's dreams had fled. Of the name and abode of this man, but little is written, for they were of the waking world only. Yet it is said that both were obscure. It is enough to know that he dwelt in a city of high walls, where sterile twilight reigned, and that he toiled all day among shadow and turmoil, coming home at evening to a room whose one window opened not on the fields and groves, but on a dim court, where other windows stared in dull despair. From that casement one might see only walls and windows, except sometimes when one leaned far out and peered aloft at the small stars that passed. And because mere walls and windows must soon drive to madness a man who dreams and reads much, the dweller in that room used night after night to lean out and peer aloft, to glimpse some fragment of things beyond the waking world, and the grayness of tall cities. After years, he began to call the slow-sailing stars by name, and to follow them in fancy when they glided regretfully out of sight, till at length his vision opens to many secret vistas, whose existence no common eye suspects. And one night, a mighty gulf was bridged, and the dream-haunted skies swelled down to the lonely watcher's window to merge with the close air of his room, and make him part of their fabulous wonder. There came to that room wild streams of violet midnight, glittering with dust of gold, vortices of dust and fire swirling out of the ultimate spaces, and heavy with perfumes from beyond the worlds. Opiate oceans poured there, litten by sun, that the eye may never behold, and having their whirlpools strange, dolphins and sea nymphs of unrememberable deeps, noiseless infinity, eddied around the dreamer, and wafted him away without even touching the body that leaned stiffly from the lonely window. And for days not counted in men's calendars, tides of far spheres bear him gently to join the dreams for which he longed, the dreams that men have lost, and in the course of many cycles they tenderly left him sleeping on a green sunrise shore, a green shore fragrant with lotus blossoms, and starred by red camelots. Camelots? I don't know what the fuck that word is. That's the end. What is camelots?
I just realized I was muted, so you didn't hear any of my camel-based jokes.
Maybe that's for the best.
The only two worth mentioning are Kamala and Camelot, which I stand by Camelot. No comment on Kamala. We don't need a politically charged stream here.
Floating island
Interesting.
is what I'm getting. Okay. Alright.
While you were reading, I made it to the moon on my Risk of Rain run. And I had the Void Key. And I had like 5 stacks of Ukulele as Acrid, which you really want as Acrid, right? But doesn't do anything for you in the Mithrix fight. I got the Polyloot. Like, the perfect time to get the Polyloot.
Hell yeah. You know, we're gonna do a slightly longer one. It's almost 20 pages, and this is gonna be the last one.
How long was the first one again?
First one was like 3 pages.
Okay. I may not be able to stay for the whole thing, but
That's fine. Well, this is one that I've wanted to read for a while. And I might even take a break in the middle.
okay. What is this one called?
This is The Color Out of Space.
Say the color out in space.
The Color Out of Space.
Okay.
Take a small break now. Let my eyes readjust for a second.
Ooh.
I am,
That was a very lucky teddy bear proc.
I am quite happy with how smoothly I've been able to read this.
Yeah, you've done a very good job. I would say much better than I could. I've never been the best popcorn reader.
I feel like I'm slowly slipping into a Dan Carlin impression, though, which is not a bad thing, but I don't know, might be some copyright infringement.
You said Dan Carlin, and my brain went to George Carlin,
Yeah.
which I don't think you're doing a George Carlin impression. Dan Carlin's the hardcore history guy, yeah?
Yeah.
I listened to Blueprint for Armageddon, and it was fucking horrifying.
Yeah.
Would your viewers like to watch me die to Mithrix Stage 2? Will you rest your eyes?
That's a slight bitch to set up.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah. I just feel like his sort of cadence of reading when he's like reading quotes from historical sources is the kind of cadence that just feels sort of natural for Lovecraft's stories.
Oh my god. Okay, we're fine. It's that, I don't know what you would call it, that, like, rotating attack, you know?
Oh, the fucking spoked wheel attack thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hate that. It's the worst.
I for some reason always think he's gonna do it 4 times, not 5 times. So I like dashed in with my utility after the 4th one, and then got hit by like 3 of them. Ah, fuck. Oh, the elixir saved me.
I actually don't have any prior knowledge about this one. Although I think there's a Darkest Dungeon DLC based on the color out of space.
Interesting.
Alright, so I'm gonna quote it with the transatlantic accent because I feel like I'm not doing it justice too much. We'll work on it at some point, but now's not the time. For the foreword, we have the final tale in Lovecraft's tremendous burst of fiction writing in 1926 to 1927. This novelette was written in March 1927. Some critics have conjectured the influence of Charles Fort with his hints of extraterrestrial incursions from meteorites and similar sources. But Lovecraft read Fort's book of the Damned in 1919, only toward the end of March. In this tale, Lovecraft richly develops his imaginary New England topography, this time in a rural setting. Edmund Wilson, generally hostile to Lovecraft's work, found much merit in the story's anticipation of the effects of atomic radiation on living creatures. Lovecraft submitted the story directly to Amazing Stories, without sending it first to Weird Tales. Hugo Gernsback of Amazing accepted it readily, but paid Lovecraft only $25 for it. Damn.
It's like $35 in today's money.
In 1927? I don't know, I feel like that's actually far more.
How much was it?
$25 in 1927.
It would be about $450 today.
Okay.
Which is still, not a lot.
It's not a lot, but like, for like a 18-page story,
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of fine.
Depends on how good it is.
And it depends,
Honestly.
I guess, on like, you know, the, what is it, the pay structure for these kind of publications. Seems like they're shafting their authors back in the 20s. But here we go. The color out of space. West of Arkham, the hills rise wild, and there are valleys with deep woods that no axe has ever cut. There are dark, narrow glens with trees slope fantastically, and where thin brooklets trickle without ever having caught the glint of sunlight. On the gentler slopes there are farms, ancient and rocky, with squat, moss-coated cottages, brooding eternally over old New England secrets in the lee of great legends. But these are all vacant now. The wide chimneys crumbling and the shingle sides bulging perilously beneath low gambrel roofs. The old folk have gone away, and foreigners do not like to live there. French Canadians have tried it, Italians have tried it, and the Poles have come and departed. It is not because of anything that can be seen or heard or handled, but because of something that is imagined. The place is not good for the imagination. It does not bring restful dreams at night. It must be this which keeps the foreigners away, for old Emmy Pierce has never told them of anything he recalls from the strange days. Emmy, whose head has been a little queer for years, is the only one who still remains, and whoever talks of the strange days. And he dares to do this because this house is so near the open fields and the traveled roads around Arkham. There was once a road over the hills and through the valleys that ran straight where the blasted heath is now. People ceased to use it, and a new road was laid curving far toward the south. Traces of the old one can still be found amidst the weeds of a returning wild wilderness. And some of them will doubtlessly linger, even when half the hollows are flooded for the new reservoir. Then the dark woods will be cut down, and the blasted heath will slumber far below blue waters whose surface will mirror the sky and ripple in the sun. And the secrets of the strange days will be one with the deep's secrets, one with the hidden lore of old ocean, and all the mystery of primal earth. When I went into the hills and vales to survey for the new reservoir, they told me the place was evil. They told me this in Arkham. And because that is a very old town full of witch legends, I thought the evil must be something which Grandams had whispered to children through centuries. The name Blasted Heath seemed to me very odd and theatrical, and I wondered how it had come into the folklore of a Puritan people. Then I saw the dark westward tangle of glens and slopes for myself, and ceased to wonder at anything besides its own elder mystery. It was morning when I saw it, but shadow lurked always there. The trees grew too thickly, and their trunks were too big for any healthy New England wood. There was too much silence in the dim alleys between them, and the floor was too soft, with the dank moss and mattings of infinite years of decay. In the open spaces, mostly along the line of the old road, there were little hillside farms, sometimes with all the buildings standing, sometimes with only one or two, sometimes with only a lone chimney or fast-filling cellar. Weeds and briars reigned. Furtive wild things rustled in the undergrowth. Upon everything was a haze of restlessness and oppression, a touch of the unreal and the grotesque, as if some vital element of perspective or chiaroscuro were awry. I did not wonder that the foreigners would not stay, for this was no region to sleep in. It was too much like a landscape of Salvatore Rosa, too much like some forbidden woodcut in a tale of terror. even all of this was not so bad as the blasted heath. I knew it the moment I came upon it, at the bottom of a spacious valley, for no other name could fit such a thing, or any other thing fit such a name. It was as if the poet had coined the phrase from having seen it this one particular region. It must, I thought, as I viewed it, be the outcome of a fire. But why had nothing ever grown over those 5 acres of gray, desolate, that sprawled open to the sky like a great spot eaten by acid in the woods and fields? It lay largely to the north of the ancient road line, but encroached a little on the other side. I felt an odd reluctance about approaching, and did so at last only because my business took me through and past it. There was no vegetation of any kind on that broad expanse, but only a fine gray dust or ash which no wind seemed ever to blow about. The trees near it were...
Sorry.
I'm about to finish this paragraph in a second.
Okay.
Pause that. The trees near it were sickly and stunted, and many dead trunks stood or lay rotting at the rim. As I walked hurriedly by, I saw the tumbled bricks and stones of an old chimney and a cellar on my right, and the yawning black maw of an abandoned well, whose stagnant vapors played strange tricks with the hues of the sunlight. Even the long, dark woodland climb beyond seemed welcome in contrast, and I marveled no more at the frightened whispers of Arkham people. There had been no house or ruin near. Even the old days, the place must have been lonely and remote. And at twilight, dreading to repass that ominous spot, I walked circuitously back to the town by the curving road on the south. I vaguely wished some clouds would gather, for an odd timidity about the deep, skyey voids above had crept into my soul. Okay. Pause there.
It may just be the small New England town, but this is very Stephen King vibes so far. Not the writing style, but just like
The atmosphere.
yeah, like the way he's describing it. Just
Interesting.
me like dairy vibes. The town from It,
Nice.
which of all the 2,500 page books I've read, it's probably the only one I would recommend.
Interesting.
That book was real fucking good.
I don't know. Never really seemed to get into Stephen King too much myself.
So, I am not a horror fan in general. I don't care for the genre. I fucking love Stephen King. Entirely because he writes characters so well. Like, every single book that I have read from him has had very believable, dynamic, like, I don't want to say likable as, like, if they were people I knew in real life, I would like them. But, like, even the bad guys you're kind of rooting for by the end, when the bad guys aren't psychodemonic clowns.
I see.
You know, like, when the bad guys are real people, like, you know them. Like, you understand why they're doing what they're doing.
I gotcha.
He writes just fantastic characters. If you were gonna read one just to give it a shot, I would say The Shining.
Well, I watched The Shining, and I know that reading The Shining is a different experience. I might give it a shot, but I thought The Shining was just okay.
The movie was certainly okay. It's a completely different plot.
Okay.
Like, it follows the same guy goes crazy in a motel or a hotel that he's staying at for the winter. But like the ending is completely different. The whole like all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy is not in the book at all.
Sure.
Which is funny because it's the most iconic scene in the movie. But yeah, like it's much more of a slow decline. That is, I don't want to say more believable, but it certainly is. It's more personal though. You know, like,
yeah,
he's such a likable character.
I might end up reading The Shining. We'll see.
Yeah.
Let's get back into this. In the evening, I asked old people in Arkham about the Blasted Heath, what was meant by that phrase, strange days, which so many evasively muttered. I could not, however, get any good answers, except that all the mystery was much more recent than I had dreamed. It was not a matter of old legendary legendary at all, but something within the lifetime of those who spoke. It had happened in the 80s, and the family had disappeared or was killed. Speakers would not be exact, and because they all told me to pay no attention to old Amy Pierce's crazy tales, I sought him out the next morning, having heard that he lived alone in the ancient tottering cottage, where the trees first begin to get very thick. It was a fearsomely archaic place, and had begun to exude the faint miasmal odor which clings about houses that have stood too long. Only with persistent knocking could I rouse the aged man. When he shuffled timidly to the door, I could tell he was not glad to see me. He was not so feeble as I had expected, but his eyes drooped in a curious way, and his unkempt clothing, the white beard, made him seem very worn and dismal. Not knowing just how he could best be launched on his tales, I feigned a matter of business. I told him of my surveying, and asked vague questions about the district. He was far brighter and more educating than I had been led to think. Before I knew it, I had grasped quite as much of the subject as any man I had talked with in Arkham. He was not like other rustics I had known in the sections where reservoirs were to be. From him, there were no protests at the miles of old wood and farmland to be blotted out, though perhaps there would have been, had not his home lain outside the bounds of the future lake. Relief was all that he shewed, relief at the doom of the dark ancient valleys through which he had roamed all his life. They were better underwater now, better underwater since the strange days, and with this opening, his husky voice sank low, while his body leaned forward, and his right forefinger began to point shakily and impressively. It was then that I had heard the story, and as the rambling voice scraped and whispered on, I shivered again and again, despite the summer day. Often I had to recall the speaker for ramblings, piece out scientific points which he knew only by a fading parrot memory of professors' talk, or bridge over gaps where his sense of logic and continuity broke down. When he was done, I did not wonder that his mind had snapped a trifle, or that the folk of Ark would not speak much of the blasted heath. I hurried back before sunset to my hotel, unwilling to have the stars come out above me in the open, and the next day returned to Boston to give up my position. I could not go into that dim chaos of old forest and slope again, or face another time that grey blasted heath, where the black well yawned deep beside the tumbled bricks and stones. The reservoir will soon be built now, and all those elder secrets will be safe forever under watery fathoms. But even then, I do not believe I would like to visit that country by night. At least, not when the sinister stars are out, and nothing could bribe me to drink the new city water of Arkham. It all began, old Amy said, with the meteorite. Before that time, there had been no wild legends at all since the witch trials. And even then, these western woods were not feared half so much as the small island in the Miskatonic, where the devil had held court beside a curious stone altar, older than the Indians. These were not haunted woods, and their fantastic dusk were never terrible till the strange days. Then there had come that white noontide cloud, that string of explosions in the air, and that pillar of smoke from the valley far in the wood. And by night, all Arkham had heard of the great rock that fell out of the sky and bedded itself in the ground beside the well at the Nahum Gardner place. That was the house which had stood where the blasted heath was to come. The trimmed white Nahum Gardner house, amidst its fertile gardens and orchards. Nahum had come to town to tell the people about the stone, and had dropped in at Amy's Pierce's on the way. Amy was 40 then, and all the queer things were fixed very strongly in his mind. He and his wife had gone with the 3 professors from Miskatonic University, who hastened out the next morning to see the weird visitor from unknown stellar space. It had wondered why Nahum had called it so large the day before. It had shrunk, Nahum said, as he pointed out the big brownish mound above the ripened earth and charred grass near the archaic well, sweeping his front yard. But the wise men answered, stones do not shrink. Its heat lingered persistently, and Nahum declared it had glowed faintly in the night. The professors tried it with a geologist's hammer, and found it was oddly soft. It was, in truth, so soft as to be almost plastic. And they gouged rather than chipped a specimen to take back to the college for testing. They took it in an old pail borrowed from Nahum's kitchen, for even the small piece refused to grow cool. On the trip back, they stopped at Amy's to rest, and seemed thoughtful when Mrs. Pierce remarked that the fragment was growing smaller and burning the bottom of the pail. Truly, it was not large, but perhaps they had taken less than they thought. The day after that, all this was in June of 82. The professors had trooped out again in a great excitement. As they passed Amy's, they told him what queer things the specimen had done, how it had faded wholly away when they put it in a glass beaker. The beaker had gone too, and the wise men talked of the strange stone's affinity for silicon. It had acted quite unbelievably in that well-ordered laboratory, doing nothing at all and chewing no occluded gases when heated on charcoal, being wholly negative in the borax bead, and soon proving itself absolutely non-volatile at any producible temperature, including that of the oxyhydrogen blowpipe. On an anvil, it appeared highly malleable, and in the dark, its luminosity was very marked, stubbornly refusing to grow cool. It soon had the college in a state of real excitement, and when upon heating before the spectroscope, displayed shining bands unlike any known colors of the normal spectrum. There was much breathless talk of new elements, bizarre optical properties, and other things which puzzled men of science, were wont to say, when faced by the unknown. Hot as it was, they tested it in a crucible with all the proper reagents. Water did nothing. Hydrochloric acid was the same. Nitric acid and even aqua regia merely hissed and spattered against its torrid invulnerability. Amy had difficulty in recalling all these things, but recognized some solvents as I mentioned them in the usual order of use. There were ammonia and caustic soda, alcohol and ether, nauseous carbon disulfide, and a dozen others. But although the weight grew steadily less as time passed, the fragment seemed to be slightly cooling. There was no change in the solvents to show that they had attacked the substance at all. It was a metal, though, beyond a doubt. It was magnetic, for one thing. And after its immersion in the acid solvents, there seemed to be faint traces of the Weidmann-Staten figures found on meteoric iron. When the cooling had grown very considerable, this testing was carried on in glass, and it was in a glass beaker they left all the chips made of the original fragment during the work. The next morning, both chips and beaker were gone without a trace, and only a charred spot marked the place on the wooden shelf where they had been. Another good pausing point.
How is it that I've been a chemist for half my life and have never heard of carbon disulfide? I mean, obviously it's CS2, but I don't think I've ever heard of it being used.
Yeah, I'm unfamiliar with its use.
75% of the annual production of it goes to making viscose rayon, which is a synthetic silk-like fiber, and cellophane film. It can dissolve nonpolar chemicals, including phosphorus, sulfur, selenium, bromide, bromine, iodine, fats, resins, rubber, and asphalt.
I mean, but when you even got fucking Aqua Regia hissing and spattering against your torrid and vulnerability, like,
I feel like if Aqua Regia is hissing and spattering, then that means it's doing something, you know?
yeah, giving off some sort of gas.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Alright. Back to it. All of this the professors told Amy as they paused at his door, and once more he went with them to see the stony messenger from the stars, though this time his wife did not accompany him. It had now most certainly shrunk. Even the sober professors could not doubt the truth of what they saw. All around, the dwindling brown lump near the well was a vacant space where the earth had caved in, and whereas it had been a good 7 feet across the day before, it was now scarcely 5. It was still hot. The sages studied its surface curiously as they detached another, larger piece with hammer and chisel. They gouged deeply this time, as they pried away the smaller mass. They saw that the core thing was not quite homogeneous. They had uncovered what seemed to be the side of a large colored globule embedded in the substance. The color, which resembled some of the bands in the meteor's strange spectrum, was almost impossible to describe, and it was only by analogy that they called it color at all. Its texture was glossy, and upon tapping it, appeared to promise both a brittleness and hollowness. One of the professors gave it a smart blow with a hammer, and it burst with a nervous little pop. Nothing was emitted, and all trace of the thing vanished with the puncturing. If left behind a hollow spherical space about 3 inches across, and all thought it probable that others would be discovered as the enclosing substance wasted away. Conjecture was vain, so after a futile attempt to find additional globules by drilling, the seekers left again with their new specimen, which proved, however, as baffling in the laboratory as the predecessor had been. Aside from being almost plastic, having heat, magnetism, and slight luminosity, cooling slightly in powerful acids, possessing an unknown spectrum, wasting away in air, and attacking silicon compounds with mutual destruction as a result. It presented no identifying features whatsoever. And at the end of the tests, the college scientists were forced to own that they could not place it. It was nothing of this earth, but a piece of the great outside, and as such, dowered with outside properties, and obedient to outside laws. That night, there was a thunderstorm, and when the professors went out to Nahum's the next day, they met with a bitter disappointment. The stone, magnetic as it had been, must have had some peculiar electrical property, for it had drawn the lightning, as Nahum said, with a singular persistence. 6 times within an hour, the farmer said, saw the lightning strike the furrow in the front yard. And when the storm was over, nothing remained of a ragged... when the storm was over, nothing remained but a ragged pit by the ancient well sweep, half choked with caved-in earth. Digging had borne no fruit, and the scientists verified the fact of the utter vanishment. The failure was total, so that nothing was left to do but go back to the laboratory and test again the disappearing fragment left carefully cased in lead. The fragment lasted a week, at the end of which nothing of value had been learned of it. When it had gone, no residue was left behind, and in time the professors felt scarcely sure they had indeed seen it with waking eyes, that cryptic vestige of the fathomless gulfs outside, that lone, weird message from the other universes and other realms of matter, force, and entity. As was natural, the Arkham papers made much of the incident with its collegiate sponsoring, and sent reporters to talk with Nahum Gardner and his family. At least one Boston daily also sent a scribe, and Nahum quickly became a kind of local celebrity. He was a lean, genial person of about 50, living with his wife and 3 sons on the pleasant farmstead in the valley. He and Amy exchanged visits frequently, as did their wives, and Amy had nothing but praise for him after all these years. He seemed slightly proud of the notice his place had attracted, and talked often of the meteorite in the succeeding weeks. And July and August were hot, and Nahum worked hard at his haying in the 10-acre pasture across Chapman's Brook. His rattling wain wearing deep ruts in the shadowy lanes between. The labor tired him more than it had in other years, and he felt that age was beginning to tell on him. Then fell the time of fruit and harvest. Pears and apples slowly ripened, and Nahum vowed that his orchards were prospering as never before. The fruit was growing to phenomenal size and unwanted gloss, and in such abundance that extra barrels were ordered to handle the future crop. But with the ripening came sore disappointment, for all that gorgeous array of specious lusciousness, not one single jot was fit to eat. Into the fine flavor of the pears and apples had crept a stealthy bitterness and sickishness, so that even the smallest of bites induced a lasting disgust. It was the same with the melons and tomatoes, and Nahum sadly saw that his entire crop was lost. Quick to connect.
Sounds like what happens when I eat a mango.
Man, mangoes are good. So, it was the same with the melons and tomatoes, and Nahum sadly saw his entire crop lost. Quick to connect events, he declared the meteorite had poisoned the soil, and thanked heaven most of the other crops were in the upland lot along the road. Winter came early, and was very cold. Amy saw Nahum less often than usual, and observed that he had begun to look worried. The rest of his family, too, seemed to have grown taciturn, were far from steady in their church-going, or their attendance at the various social events of the countryside. For this reserve or melancholy no cause could be found, though all the household confessed now and then of poorer health and a feeling of vague disquiet. Nahum himself gave the most definite statements of anyone when he said he was disturbed about certain footprints in the snow. They were the usual winter prints of red squirrels, white rabbits, and foxes, but the brooding farmer professed to see something not quite right about the nature of their nature and arrangement. He was never specific, but appeared to think that they were not as characteristic of the anatomy of and habits of squirrels and rabbits and foxes as they ought to be. Amy listened without interest to this talk, until one night, when he drove past Nahum's house in his sleigh, on the way back from Clark's Corners. There had been a moon, and a rabbit had run across the road. And the leaps of the rabbit were longer than either Amy or his horse liked. The latter, indeed, had almost run away when brought up by firm rein. Therefore, Amy gave Nahum's tales more respect, and wondered why the gardener dogs seemed so cowed and quivering every morning. They had, it developed, nearly lost the spirit to bark. In February, the McGregor boys from Meadow Hill out shooting woodchucks. Not far from the garden or place, bagged a very peculiar specimen. The proportions of its body seemed slightly altered in a queer way, impossible to describe, while its face had taken on an expression which no one ever saw in a woodchuck before. The boys were genuinely frightened, and threw the thing away at once, and so that only their grotesque tales of it ever reached the people of the countryside. But the shying away of the horses near Nahum's house had now become an acknowledged thing, and all the basis for a cycle of whispered legend was fast taking form. People vowed that the snow melted faster around Nahum's than it did anywhere else. And early in March, there was an odd discussion in Potter's General Store, Clark's Corner. Stephen Rice had driven past gardeners in the morning and had noticed the skunk cabbages coming up through the mud by the woods across the road. Never were things of such size seen before. They held strange colors that could not be put into any words. Their shapes were monstrous, and the horse had snorted at an odor which struck Stephen as wholly unprecedented. That afternoon, several persons drove past to see the abnormal growth, and and all agreed that plants of that kind ought never to sprout in a healthy world. The bad fruit of the fall before was freely mentioned, and it went from mouth to mouth that there was poison in Nahum's ground. Of course, it was the meteorite. And remembering how strange the men of the college had found that stone to be, several farmers spoke about the matter to them. One day, they paid Nahum a visit. But having no love of wild tales and folklore, were very conservative in what they were inferred. The plants were certainly odd, but all skunk cabbages are more or less odd in shape and odor and hue. Perhaps some mineral element from the stone had entered the soil, but would soon be washed away. And as for the footprints and frightened horses, of course this was mere country talk, which such a phenomenon as the aerialite would be certain to start. There was really nothing for serious men to do in cases of wild gossip, for superstitious rustics will say and believe anything. And so, all through the strange days, the professors stayed away in contempt. Only one of them, when given 2 vials of dust for analysis in a police job over a year and a half later, recalled that the queer color of that skunk cabbage had been very like one of the anomalous bands of light shown by the meteor fragment in the college spectroscope. And like the brittle globule found embedded in the stone from the abyss. The samples in this analysis case gave the same odd bands at first, though later they lost the property. The trees budded prematurely around Nahum's, and at night they swayed ominously in the wind. Nahum's second son, Thaddeus, had a lad of 15. No, a lad of 15 swore that they swayed also when there was no wind. But even the gossips would not credit this. Certainly, however, restlessness was in the air. The entire Gardner family developed the habit of stealthy listening, though not for any sound for which they could consciously name. The listening was, indeed, rather a product of moments when consciousness seemed to have to slip away. Unfortunately, such moments increased week by week, until it became common speech that something was wrong with all Nahum's folks. When the early sacrifice came out, it had another strange odor. Not quite like that of the skunk cabbage, but plainly related and equally unknown to anyone who saw it. Nahum took some blossoms to Arkham and showed them to the editors of the Gazette, but that dignitary did no more than write a humorous article about it, in which the dark fears of rustics were held up to polite ridicule. It was a mistake of Nahum's to tell the stolid city man about the way the great, overgrown morning cloak butterflies behaved in connection with these sacrileges. April brought a kind of madness to the country folk, and began that disuse of the road past Nahum's which led to its ultimate abandonment. It was the vegetation. All the orchard trees blossomed forth in strange colors, and through the stony soil of the yard and adjacent pasturage, there sprang up a bizarre growth, which only a botanist could connect with the proper flora of the region. No sane, wholesome colors were anywhere to be seen, except grass and leafage, but everywhere those hectic and prismatic variants of some diseased, underlying primary tone without a place among the known tints of earth. The Dutchman's breeches became a thing of sinister menace, and the blood roots grew insolent in their chromatic perversions. Amy and the gardeners thought that most of the colors had a sort of haunting familiarity, and decided that they reminded one of the brittle globule in the meteor. Nahum plowed and sowed the 10-acre pasture and the upland lot, but did nothing with the land around the house. He knew it would be of no use, and hoped that the summer's strange growths would draw all the poison from the soil. He was prepared for almost anything now, and had grown used to the sense of something near him waiting to be heard. The shunning of his house by neighbors told on him, of course, but it told on his wife more. The boys were better off, being in school each day, but they could not help being frightened by the gossip. Thaddeus, especially sensitive youth, suffered the most. Nice place to stop for a second, because throat's starting to hurt. Give it a break for a second.
So, meteorite, big cabbage, possibly related.
Yeah. You getting it? That is also what I'm getting. So,
Oh, and
mystery metal meteorite with that makes,
stinky fruit too.
that makes funky colors. Stinky fruit. Alrighty. In May, the insects came, and Nahum's place became a nightmare of buzzing and crawling. Most of the creatures seemed not quite usual in the aspects and motions, and their nocturnal habits contradicted all former experience. The gardeners took to watching at night, watching in all directions at random for something. They could not tell what. It was then that they all owned that Thaddeus had been right about the trees. Mrs. Gardner was the next to see it from the window as she watched the swollen boughs of a maple against a moonlit sky. The boughs surely moved, and there was no wind. It must be the sap. Strangeness had come into everything growing now, and it was none of Nahum's family at all who made the next discovery. Familiarity had dulled them, when they could not see who was glimpsed by a timid windmill salesman from Bolton, who drove by one night in ignorance of the countryside legends. What he told in Arkham was given a short paragraph in the Gazette, and it was there that all the farmers, Nahum included, saw it first. The night had been dark, and the buggy lamps faint, but around the farm, the valley, which everyone knew from the account must be Nahum's, the darkness had been less thick. A dim, though distinct luminosity seemed to phosphorescence appeared to stir furtively in the yard near the barn. The grass had so far seemed untouched, and the cows were freely pastured in the lot near the house. But toward the end of May, the milk began to be bad. Then Nahum had the cows driven to the uplands, which had the trouble ceased. After which the trouble ceased. Not long after this, the change in grass and leaves became apparent to the eye. All the verdure was going gray. And was developing a highly singular quality of brittleness. Amy was now the only person who ever visited the place, and his visits were becoming fewer and fewer. When school closed, the gardeners were virtually cut off from the world, and sometimes let Amy do the errands in town. They were failing curiously, both physically and mentally, and not one was surprised when the news of Mrs. Gardner's madness stole around. It happened in June, about the anniversary of the meteor's fall. The poor woman screamed about things in the air which she could not describe. In her ravings, there was not a single specific noun, but only verbs and pronouns. Things moved and changed and fluttered, and ears tingled to impulses which were not wholly sounds. Something was taken away. She was being drained of something. Something was fastening itself on her that ought not to be. Someone must make it keep off. Nothing was ever still in the night. The walls and windows shifted. Nahum did not send her to the country asylum, but let her wander about the house, as long as she was harmless to herself and others. Even with her expression changed, he did nothing. But when the boys grew afraid of her, Thaddeus nearly fainted at the way she made faces at him, he decided to keep her locked in the attic. By July, she had ceased to speak, and crawled on all fours. Before that month was over, Nahum got the mad notion that she was slightly luminous in the dark, as he now clearly saw was the case with the nearby vegetation. It was a little before this the horses had stampeded. Something had aroused them in the night, and their neighing and kicking in the stalls had been terrible. There seemed virtually nothing to do to calm them, and when Nahum opened the stable door, they all bolted out like frightened woodland deer. It took a week to track all four, and when found, they were seen to be quite useless and unmanageable. Something had snapped in their brains, and each one had to be shot for its own good. Nahum borrowed a horse from Amy for its haying, but found it would not approach the barn. It shied, balked, and whinnied, and in the end he could do nothing but drive it into the yard while the men used their own strength to get the heavy wagon near enough the hay loft for convenient pitching. And all the while the vegetation was turning gray and brittle. Even the flowers, whose hue had been so strange, were graying now. The fruit was coming out gray and dwarfed and tasteless. The asters and goldenrod bloomed gray, distorted, and the roses and zinnias and hollyhocks in the front yard were such blasphemous-looking things that Nahum's old boys, Zenas, cut them down. strangely puffed insects died about the same time. Even the bees that had left their hives had taken to the woods. By September, all the vegetation was fast crumbling to a grayish powder, and Nahum feared the trees would die before the poison was out of the soil. His wife now had spells of terrific screaming, and he and the boys were in a constant state of nervous tension. They shunned people now. When school opened, the boys did not go. But it was Annie, on one of his rare visits, first realized that the well water was no longer good. It had an evil taste that was not exactly fetid, nor exactly salty. And Emmy advised his friends to dig another well on higher ground to use till. To use till the soil was good again. Nahum, however, ignored the warning, for he had by that time become calloused to strange and unpleasant things. He and the boys continued to use the tainted supply, drinking it as listlessly and mechanically as they ate their meager and ill-cooked meals, and did their thankless and monotonous chores through the aimless days. There was something of stolid resignation about them all, as if they walked half in another world, between lines of nameless guards, to a certain and familiar doom. Thaddeus went mad in September after a visit to the well. He had gone with a pail and had come back empty-handed, shrieking and waving his arms, and sometimes lapsing into an inane titter or a whisper about the moving colors down there. 2 in one family was pretty bad, but Nahum was very brave about it. He let the boy run about for a week until he began stumbling and hurting himself. And then he shut him in an attic room across the hall from his mother. The way they screamed at each other from behind their locked doors was very terrible. Especially to little Merwin, who fancied they talked in some terrible language that was not of Earth. Merwin was getting frightfully imaginative. His restlessness was worse after the shutting away of the brother who had been his greatest playmate. Almost at the same time, the mortality among the livestock commenced. Poultry turned grayish and died very quickly. Their meat began being found dry and noisome upon cutting. Hogs grew inordinately fat, and then suddenly began to undergo loathsome changes, which no one could explain. Their meat was, of course, useless. Nahum was at his wit's end. No rural veterinary would approach this place. And the city veterinary from Arkham was openly baffled. The swine began growing gray and brittle, falling to pieces before they died, and their eyes and muzzles developed singular alterations. It was very inexplicable, for they had never been fed from the tainted vegetation. Then something struck the cows. Certain areas where sometimes the whole body would be uncannily shriveled or compressed, and atrocious collapses or disintegrations were common. last stages, and death was always the result. There would be a graying and turning brittle, like that which beset the hogs. There could be no question of poison, for all the cases occurred in a locked and undisturbed barn. No bites of prowling things could have brought the virus, for what live beast of earth can pass through solid obstacles? It must be only natural disease. Yet what disease could wreak such results was beyond any mind's guessing. When the harvest came, there was not an animal surviving on the place, for the stock and poultry were dead, and the dogs had run away. These dogs, 3 in number, had all vanished one night, and were never heard of again. The 5 cats had left some time before, but their going was scarcely noticed, since there now seemed to be no mice, and only Mrs. Gardner had made pets of the graceful felines. On the 19th of October, Nahum staggered into Amy's house with hideous news. The death had come to poor Thaddeus in his attic room. It had come in a way which could not be told. Nahum had dug a grave in the railed family plot behind the farm, and put therein what he found. There could have been nothing from outside, for the small barred window and locked door were intact. But it was much as it had been in the barn. Amy and his wife consoled the stricken man as best they could, but shuddered as they did so. Stark terror seemed to cling round the Gardners and all they touched. In the very presence of one in the house was a breath from regions unnamed and unnameable. Amy accompanied Nahum home with the greatest reluctance, and did what he might to calm the hysterical sobbing of little Merwin. Zenas needed no calming. He had come of late to do nothing but stare into space and obey what his father told him. And Amy thought that his fate was very merciful. Now and then Merwin's screams were answered faintly from the attic, and in response to an inquiring look, Nahum said that his wife was getting very feeble. Night approached, Amy managed to get away. For not even friendship could make him stay in that spot when the faint glow of the vegetation began. The trees may or may not have swayed without wind. It was really lucky for Amy that he was not more imaginative. Even as things were, his mind was bent ever so slightly, but he had been able to connect and reflect upon all the portents around him. He must inevitably have turned a total maniac. In the twilight he hastened home, the screams of the mad woman and the nervous child ringing horribly in his ears. Three days later, Nahum lurched into Amy's kitchen in the early morning, and in the absence of his host, stammered out a desperate tale once more. While Mrs. Pierce listened in a clutching fright, it was little Merwin this time. He was gone. He had gone out late at night with a lantern and pail for water, and had never come back. He'd been going to pieces for days, and hardly knew what he was about. Screamed at everything. There had been frantic shriek from the front yard then. But before the father could get to the door, the boy was gone. There was no glow from the lantern he had taken, and of the child himself no trace. At the time, Nahum thought the lantern and pail were gone too. When dawn came, and plodded back from his all-night search of the woods and fields, he had found some very curious things near the well. There was a crushed, apparently somewhat melted mass of iron, which had certainly been the lantern, while a bent bale and twisted iron tubes beside it, both half fused, seemed to hint at the remnants of the pail. That was all. Nahum was past imagining. Mrs. Pierce was blank. Ami, when he had reached home and heard the tale, could give no guess. Merwin was gone, and there would be no use in telling the people around, who shunned all gardeners now. No use either telling the city people at Arkham who laughed at everything. Thad was gone, and now Murney was gone. Something was creeping, and waiting to be seen, and felt, and heard. Nahum would go soon, and he wanted Ami to look after his wife and Xenis, if they survived him. It must all be a judgment of some sort, though he could not fancy what for, since he had always walked upright in the Lord's ways so far as he knew. For over 2 weeks, Ami saw nothing of a Nahum. And then, worried about what might have been, or what might happen, he overcame his fears and paid the gardener's place a visit. There was no smoke from the great chimney, and for a moment the visitor was apprehensive of the worst. The aspect of the whole farm was shocking. Grayish, withered grass and leaves on the ground. Vines falling in brittle wreckage from archaic walls and gables. And great bare trees clawing up at the gray November sky. The studied malevolence, which Ami could not but feel had come from some subtle change in the tilt of the branches. But Nahum was alive, after all. He was weak and lying on a couch in the low-ceiled kitchen, but perfectly conscious and able to give simple orders to Xenis. The room was deadly cold, and as Ami visibly shivered, the host shouted huskily to Xenis for more wood. Wood, indeed, was sorely needed, since the cavernous fireplace was unlit and empty. With a cloud of soot blowing about the chill wind that came down the chimney, presently Nahum asked him if the extra wood had made him any more comfortable. And then Ami saw what happened. The stoutest cord had broken at last, and the hapless farmer's mind was proof against more sorrow. Questioning tactfully, Ami could get no clear data at all about the missing Xenis. In the well, he lives in the well, was all that the clouded father would say. Then there flashed across the visitor's mind the sudden thought of the mad wife, and he changed his line of inquiry. Abby? Why, here she is, was the surprised response of poor Nahum. And Ami soon saw that he must search for himself. Leaving the harmless babbler on the couch, he took the keys from their nail beside the door and climbed the creaking stairs to the attic. It was very close and noise from up there. No sound could be heard from any direction. Of the 4 doors in sight, only one was locked. On this, he tried various keys on the ring he had taken. The 3rd key proved the right one, and after some fumbling, Ami threw open the low white door. It was quite dark inside, for the window was small and half obscured by the crude wooden bars. Ami could see nothing at all on the wide planked floor. The stench was beyond enduring, and before proceeding further, he had no retreat. He had to retreat to another room and return with his lungs filled with breathable air. When he did enter, he saw something dark in the corner, and upon seeing it more clearly, he screamed outright. While he screamed, he thought a momentary cloud eclipsed the window, and a second later he felt himself brushed as if by some hateful current of vapor. Strange colors danced before his eyes, and a not a present horror numbed him. He would have thought of the globule in the meteor that the geologist's hammer had shattered, and of the morbid vegetation that had sprouted in the spring. As it was, he thought only of the blasphemous monstrosity which confronted him, and which all too clearly had shared the nameless fate of young Thaddeus and the livestock. The terrible thing about this horror was that very slowly and perceptibly moved as it continued to crumble. Ami would give me no added particulars to the scene, but the shape in the corner does not reappear in his tale as a moving object. There are things which cannot be mentioned, and what is done in common humanity is sometimes crudely judged by the law. I gathered that no moving thing was left in that attic room, and that to leave anything capable of motion there would have been a deed so monstrous as to damn any accountable being to eternal torment. Anyone but a stolid farmer would have fainted or gone mad. But Ami walked conscious through that low doorway and locked the accursed secret behind him. There would be Nahum to deal with now. He must be fed and tended, or moved to some place where he could be cared for. Commencing his descent of the dark stairs, Ami heard a thud below him. He even thought a scream had been suddenly choked off, and recalled nervously the clammy vapor which had brushed him in that frightful room above. What presence had his cry and entry started up? Halted by some vague fear, he heard a most detestable sticky noise, as some fiendish and unclean species of suction. With an associative sense goaded to feverish heights, he thought unaccountably of what he had seen upstairs. Good God, what eldritch dream world was this into which he had blundered? He dared not move neither backward nor forward, but stood there trembling at the black curve boxed in the staircase. Every trifle of the scene burned itself into his brain. The sound, the sense of dread, expectancy, Steps, sides, exposed lathes, and beams alike. Then there burst forth a frantic whinny from Ami's house. Ami's horse outside, followed at once by a clatter which told of a frenzied runaway. In another moment, horse and buggy had gone beyond earshot, leaving the frightened man on the dark stairs to guess what had sent them. But that was not all. There had been another sound out there, a sort of liquid splash. Water. It must have been the well. He had left Hero untied near it, and the buggy wheel must have brushed the coping and knocked into the stone. Still, the pale phosphorescence glowed in the detestably ancient woodwork. God, how old the house was. Most of it built before 1670, and the gambrel roof not later than 1730. A feeble scratching on the floor downstairs now sounded distinctly, and Ami's grip tightened on a heavy stick he had picked up in the attic for some purpose, slowly nerving himself. He finished his descent and walked boldly toward the kitchen, but he did not complete the walk, as what he sought was no longer there. It had come to meet him. It was still alive after a fashion. Whether it had crawled or whether it had been dragged by any external force, Amy could not say. The death had been at it. Everything had happened in the last half hour. No, everything had happened in the last half hour, but collapse, graying, disintegration were already far advanced. There was a horrible brittleness, and dry fragments were scaling off. Emmy could not touch it, but looked horrified. It looked horrifiedly into the distorted parody that had been a face. What was it, ma'am? What was it? He whispered. The cleft, bulging lips were just able to crackle out a final answer. Nothing. Nothing. The color, it burns. Cold and wet. But it burns. It lived in the well. I seen it. The kind of smoke. Just like the flowers last spring. Well shown at night. Thad and Murney and Zenis, everything alive. Sucking the life out of everything. That stone. Must have come in that stone. Poison the whole place. Won't know what it wants. That round thing. Them men from college dug out of the stone. They smashed it. It was that same color. Just the same. Flowers and plants. Must have been more of them. Seeds. Seeds. They growed. I seen it the first time this week. Strong. Must have got strong on Zenis. He was a big boy, full of life. Beats down your mind and gets you. Burns you up in the well water. He was right about that. Evil water. Zenis never come back from the well. Can't get away. Draws you. You know something's coming. It ain't no use. See him time and again. Saint Zenis was tooked. We're never head's no good. Don't know how long since I fed her. Get her if we ain't careful. It's just the color. Face is getting to that color sometimes toward night. And it burns and sucks. It comes from some place where things ain't as they is here. Well, then the professor said so. He was right. Look out, Amy. We'll do something more. Sucks the life out. But that was all. That which spoke could speak no more, because it had completely caved in. Amy laid a red checked tablecloth over what was left and reeled out the back door into the fields. He climbed the slopes to the 10-acre pasture and stumbled home by the north road and the woods. He could not pass that well from which his horse had run away. He had looked at it through the window and seen that no stone was missing from the rim. Then the lurching buggy had not dislodged anything after all. The splash had been something else. Something which went into the well after it had done with poor Naomi. When Amy reached the house, the horse and buggy had arrived before throwing his wife into fits of anxiety. Reassuring her without explanations, he set out at once for Arkham. Notified the authorities that the Gardner family was no more. He indulged in no details, but merely told of their deaths of Nahum and Abby, and that of Thaddeus being already known, and mentioned that the cause seemed to be the same strange ailment which had killed the livestock. He also stated that Merlin and Zenas had disappeared. There was considerable questioning at the police station, and in the end, Amy was compelled to take 3 officers to the Gardner farm. Together with the coroner, the medical examiner, and the veterinary had treated diseased animals, he went much against his will. For the afternoon was advancing, and he feared the fall of night was over that accursed place. But it was some comfort to have so many people with him. The 6 men drove out in a Democrat wagon, following Amy's buggy, and arrived at the pest-ridden farmhouse about 4 o'clock. Used as the officers were to gruesome experiences, not one remained unmoved at what was found in the attic and under the red checked tablecloth of the floor below. The whole aspect of the farm, with its gray desolation, was terrible enough. Those 2 crumbling objects were beyond all bounds. No one could look long at them, and even the medical examiner admitted there was very little to examine. Specimens could be analyzed, of course, so he busied himself entertaining them. And here it develops that a very puzzling aftermath occurred at the college laboratory. The 2 vials of dust were finally taken. Under the spectroscope, both samples gave off an unknown spectrum, in which many of the baffling bands were precisely like those of the strange meteor had yielded in the previous year. The property of emitting this spectrum vanished in a month. The dust thereafter consisting mainly of alkaline phosphates and carbonates. Amy would not have told the men about the well if he had thought they meant to do anything then and was getting toward sunset. He was anxious to be away, but he could not help glancing nervously at the stony curb by the great sweep. And when a detective questioned him, he admitted that Nahum had feared something down there. So much so that he had never even thought of searching it for Merwin or Zennis. After that, nothing would do but that they empty and explore the well immediately. So Amy had to wait there, trembling, while pail after pail of rank water was hauled up and splashed on the soapy ground outside. The men sniffed in disgust at the fluid. Toward the last, held their noses against the fetid they were uncovering. It was not so long a job as they had feared it would be, since the water was phenomenally low. There's no need to speak too exactly of what they found. Merwin and Zennis were both there, in part, though the vestiges were mainly skeletal. There were a small deer and a large dog in about the same state, and a number of bones of smaller animals. The ooze and slime at the bottom seemed inexplicably porous and bubbling, and a man who descended on handholds with a long pole found that he could sink the wooden shaft to any depth in the mud of the floor without meeting any solid obstruction. I still have like 6 pages or so to go, but my throat hurts and it is after midnight. So
When the fuck did it become midnight?
What?
When the fuck did it become after midnight?
I know, right?
Where can you like send me whatever PDF you're reading from or whatever?
I'm reading from the book I have.
An actual book?
Yeah.
What is this? The Middle Ages? Alright, well in that case, can you send me the name of this so I can find a PDF?
It is The Color Out of Space.
When I found and bookmarked a PDF. What page are you? Never mind, I found it. Okay. I will be finishing this because it's quite encapsulating. I love wells filled with horse bodies. Yeah. That's what more people should be writing about. We used to be a real country.
Yeah. Or we didn't ask no questions about no bones in our wells. Yeah. That was fun. I will probably read the rest of this tonight. Just to myself.
Work.
But yeah, I do think that this would be a good thing to like go through and record like actual readings of all the short stories that I can, or at least of the good ones.
Yeah.